Morning light filtered lazily through the thick curtains of the living room, scattering soft patches of light around the room. The Harper home, modern, with clean lines and large windows, seemed the perfect setting for a domestic idyll. The pale brick walls, the wood floors polished to a shine, and the minimalist furniture were all the work of Jack Harper, an architect who knew how to create a space that spoke of stability. But there was something else in the air, something as subtle as the smell of day-old coffee clinging to the kitchen countertops. Jack stood at the stove, flipping a pancake in the frying pan. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, as if he were designing not only the buildings but his own behavior. Tall, with a slight gray at the temples, he looked younger than his 38 years. His dark blue shirt was neatly tucked into his trousers, and his gaze, fixed on the frying pan, betrayed no hint of emotion. "Sam, come down. Breakfast is ready," he shouted, without looking up from his work. There was a thud from above, then the clatter of feet on the stairs. Sam, a skinny teenager with wild dark bangs, burst into the kitchen, dropping his backpack by the door. His sneakers left a light mark on the immaculate floor. "Pancakes?" "Seriously?" Sam grimaced, but there was no real irritation in his voice. He plopped down in his chair, reaching for his phone. "Seriously," Jack replied calmly, placing a plate in front of his son. "Eat it while it's hot." Sam lifted his fork to his mouth, muttering through his mouthful. "You know that I'm more into toasts. And I know you spend too much time with this." Jack nodded at the phone. "No screens at the table. That's what we agreed on." "Us or you," Sam muttered, but put the phone in his pocket. Jack said nothing, just poured coffee. One cup, black, no sugar, for himself. The other, with a drop of milk, the way Kate liked it. He set it on the table, next to the empty chair, and glanced at his watch. 7 in the morning. She should have been down by now. "Where is your mother?" he asked, trying to keep an even tone. Sam shrugged. "Upstairs, probably. As always." He poked at the pancake with his fork. "Did you argue with her again?" Jack pressed his lips together, then exhaled slowly through his nose. "No. We just have a little bit of a schedule conflict." "Well, yeah. Graphics." Sam squinted. "She spent the whole evening in the bedroom last night, and you in the office. We didn't even say goodbye." Jack put his cup on the table and sat down opposite. "Sam, I don't want you to get caught up in this. Sometimes adults just get tired of each other." Sam interrupted. "I've heard that before. On TV, in movies, and in this life too. It's all clear." He stared at his plate, not touching his food again. A tense silence fell over the kitchen. A few seconds later, the door creaked upstairs. Soft footsteps sounded on the stairs. "Here she is," Jack said quietly, as if to himself. Kate appeared a few minutes later, her steps soft, almost inaudible. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and there were shadows under her eyes that weren't hidden by the light makeup. She was wearing a dark green dress that showed off her slender frame, but something about her posture, her shoulders slightly hunched, her gaze downcast, betrayed fatigue. Not physical fatigue, but a deep fatigue, as if she were carrying a burden no one asked about. "Good morning," she said, sitting down at the table. Her voice was even, but there was a tension in it, like a string about to snap. "Morning," Jack said, pushing the coffee toward her. "You're late today." Kate took the cup, wrapping both hands around it as if warming herself. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the surface of the black liquid. "I stayed up late with my essay yesterday. The students turned in something incomprehensible again," she answered, not looking at anyone. "I had to sort it out until midnight." Sam snorted, not looking up from his phone. "Yeah, it's like they read your comments." Kate gave him a quick glance, a mixture of irritation and sadness in it. "Sam, put your phone away while you eat," she said, but there was no real sternness in her tone. "Yay, right, because if I don't look at the screen, maybe you and Dad will start talking like normal people," he muttered, putting the phone on the edge of the table. "Sam," Jack said sternly, "that's enough." "What do you mean, enough?" Sam leaned back in his chair. I just said that everyone is acting like there's no one else here. We're trying to keep the morning normal, Kate said, raising her voice slightly. You want us to yell at each other in front of you. It would be better if they shouted than all this, he waved his hand. Ice in the words, emptiness in the eyes, and pancakes on schedule. Just the perfect picture. Jack took a deep breath, clearly audible. We don't want to quarrel, especially in front of you. Sam shrugged and muttered quietly. It's too late already. There was a pause. Kate tapped her fingernail nervously on her cup. I thought you were going to the office early today, she said to Jack, without changing her expression. Rescheduled the meeting. For breakfast. His voice was restrained, almost emotionless. After all, we are a family. Kate smiled, but without joy. Interesting definition. Would you suggest something else? Jack asked calmly. I would suggest it, but I'm not sure Sam should hear it. The silence at the table was uneasy, as if each of them was waiting for the other to speak first. But no one did. Do you have a presentation today? Jack asked Kate, breaking the silence. She nodded without looking up. Yes, a new group. Introduction to Shakespeare. Nothing special. Shakespeare, Sam chuckled. Boring. Why even read it? Kate tensed slightly, her fingers tightening around her cup. Because it teaches you to think, Sam, to understand people, their choices, their mistakes. Yeah, like Romeo and Juliet were that smart, he retorted, leaning back in his chair. Two idiots who died because they couldn't talk properly. Jack chuckled, but his eyes remained serious. Sometimes people really can't talk, he said quietly, looking at Kate. She met his gaze, but only for a second. Then she looked back at her coffee, as if there was something more important there. Maybe so, she answered, almost in a whisper. The rest of breakfast passed in silence. Sam finished his pancake, grabbed his backpack, and with a short bye, ran out the door. Jack cleared the dishes, methodically stacking the plates in the dishwasher. Kate finished her coffee and stood up, straightening her dress. See you tonight? Jack asked without turning around. If I'm not late, she replied, already heading for the exit. I still have a department meeting. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Jack paused for a second, looking at the empty table. Then he turned off the coffee maker and walked out of the kitchen. Kate walked across the college campus, her heels clicking on the asphalt. The autumn air was cool, leaves crunching under her feet. She loved this place, the old brick buildings covered in ivy, the bustling hallways filled with students. But today everything seemed muted, as if someone had turned the world down. Her thoughts wandered from the lecture she was preparing to the conversation they were having over breakfast. Jack was calm, as always. Too calm. It irritated her more than she cared to admit. The students were already waiting for her in the auditorium. The conversations died down as she entered, placing her bag on the table. She turned on the projector, and the first line of Hamlet appeared on the screen. To be or not to be, that is the question. Today we begin with Shakespeare, she began, trying to inject into her voice an enthusiasm she didn't feel. These aren't just words about life and death. They're about choice, about how we deal with doubt, with pain, with betrayal. The students were silent, some taking notes, others just looking at her. Kate knew half of them weren't listening, but she kept going anyway. She needed to talk to keep her mind off herself. After the lecture, she lingered in the auditorium, gathering up her papers. The door creaked and Liam Brooks walked in. His blonde hair was a little tousled, and his smile, as always, seemed too sincere to be true. He was dressed in a dark sweater and jeans, and there was something about his relaxed manner that made Kate feel more alive. Excellent lecture, he said, leaning against the doorframe. You make Shakespeare sound like he wrote it yesterday. Kate smiled, but it was forced. Thanks, Liam. Although it seems like half the room is asleep. I wasn't sleeping, I was dreaming, he winked, coming closer. You're kind of, not here today, is everything okay? She shrugged, putting her laptop back in her bag. I'm just tired, lots of work. Liam nodded, but his gaze was intense, almost piercing. Work, of course. But you know you can talk to me if something's wrong, right? Kate looked at him, and for a second she wanted to tell him everything about the emptiness in her life, about how she felt trapped in a perfect house with a perfect husband. But instead, she just nodded. I know. Thank you. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that she couldn't quiet. Something dark, like a shadow passing outside the window. Listen, he continued softly. I'm not trying to pry. It's just, sometimes you look at your watch in the middle of a lecture, like you're waiting for something, or someone, and you never get it. Kate froze for a second. Are you a psychologist now? She tried to joke, but her voice sounded too harsh. No, he shrugged. Just a guy who notices when a friend is drowning, even if he does it silently. She turned away, adjusting the strap of her bag, as if she were seeking support in this gesture. It's okay, Liam. Honestly, it's just family routine. Home, son, husband, everything requires attention. Does anyone give you attention? He asked quietly. Her fingers tightened on the strap. It's none of your business. He sighed and looked out the window. Silence hung between them, taut as a string. I'm sorry, he finally said. He chuckled and shook his head. I'm worried. Sometimes the way you say everything's fine is scary. Kate slowly sank down onto the edge of the lectern. Sometimes good is just a way of saying tolerable. Liam moved closer, his voice quieter, almost intimate. What if I suggested doing something to make things better? Even for an hour, for an evening, I don't know. Just getting out of here, drinking some wine, talking for real, without masks. Kate looked up at him, her eyes full of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to express. You don't understand. It's not that simple. Then explain. I'm not asking for much, just honesty. She hesitated, then stood up, picked up her bag, and walked past him to the door. If I start being honest, she said quietly, turning around, I'm not sure I'll be able to stop. He didn't hold her back. He just nodded, not taking his eyes off her. Maybe this is exactly what you're waiting for, to finally stop being silent. Kate didn't answer. She just left. Jack sat in his office, surrounded by blueprints and sketches. His firm was designing a new housing complex, and he was in his element lines, angles, calculations. Everything is under control. Here, everything was subject to logic and formula. Every element had its place. But his thoughts kept returning to the morning. Kate seemed distant, and it wasn't the first time. He'd noticed it for months, her silence, her eyes that avoided him. It was as if she were slowly disappearing, not physically, but from the inside. Jack wasn't one to delve into feelings, but even he couldn't ignore the rift growing between them. The phone vibrated on the table. He jumped out of his thoughts. A message from Sam. Mom forgot to pick me up from school. Can you come? He frowned. Kate never forgot about Sam. Never. Even when she was busy. Even when they argued. He dialed her number instantly. A few rings and an answering machine. He set his jaw and put the phone down, then immediately picked it up and dialed again. Nothing. He wrote a short message. Where are you? Sam is waiting. There was no response. He looked at his watch. It was almost 4:15. Sam could have waited a little longer, but the boy was clearly nervous. He had texted his father instead of just sitting on the bench with his phone in his hands, as usual. Jack stood up, quickly put the papers in a folder, and threw it to the secretary on the go. I've left. I'll be back later or tomorrow morning. If anything happens, stay in touch. Are you okay, Jack? She asked, looking at his frowning face. No, he answered briefly and left. On the way, he checked his messages twice more. Nothing from Kate. No call, not even a read receipt. He arrived at the school 20 minutes later. Sam was sitting on the steps outside the entrance, his backpack at his feet, headphones in his ears. When he saw his father's car, he stood up, but his face remained displeased. Have you talked to her? He asked, getting into the car. I tried. He doesn't answer. Great, Sam muttered, probably with his laptop again, or Liam. Jack looked at him sharply. What? Sam opened his mouth, realized he had said too much, and closed it. Then, unable to contain himself, he added, "He sometimes comes to her after lectures. I saw him when I was on campus. They went away together once, in his car." Jack gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. "You are sure? I don't follow her, if that's what you mean. It's just..." She laughs differently with him. "You haven't laughed with her in a long time." The car moved off. Inside it was dull with tension. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" "Why? You both lie as if I don't see you." "But I see everything, Dad." Jack was silent. His head was buzzing. When they got home, Kate was gone. Neither was the car nor her coat in the hallway. In the bedroom, the bed was still made, and her phone was on the nightstand turned off. Jack stood in the doorway, paralyzed. "What's going on?" he asked out loud, but there was no answer. He went to the phone, opened the drawer empty. Usually, there was a charger, her glasses, and a notebook with notes. Everything was gone. He slowly sat down on the edge of the bed and clutched her empty phone case in his hand. Then he dialed her again. No answer. The screen shows the same message. Not available. He realized something had changed, and no longer in the drawings, not along the lines, not according to his plan. Kate was sitting in a cafe across from the college, across from Liam. They were drinking coffee, and he was telling her something about his latest trip to Europe, but she was barely listening. Her phone was lying face down on the table. She knew she should check her messages, but instead she was looking at Liam, at his hands moving as he spoke, at his smile, which seemed so easy. Too easy. "Kate, you've flown off again," he said, leaning a little closer. "What's going on?" She shook her head, trying to smile. "Nothing. I just think a lot." "About him?" Liam asked, his voice quieter, almost intimate. Kate froze. She hadn't expected him to ask so directly, but there was no judgment in his gaze, only curiosity, and something else that made her heart beat faster. "Not only," she answered evasively, "about everything." Liam nodded, but his smile widened a little, as if he knew more than she was willing to say. Jack parked at the school. Sam was sitting on a bench near the entrance, staring at his phone. When he noticed his father, he stood up, throwing his backpack over his shoulder. "Is Mom at her lectures again?" he asked, getting into the car. "Probably," Jack replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. "She's busy." Sam chuckled, looking out the window. "Yeah, as always." Jack glanced at him, but said nothing. He turned on the radio, and the car filled with a soft melody. But even the music couldn't drown out the silence that was growing between them. When they got home, Kate was still gone. Jack had cooked dinner, simple but neatly served. Sam ate in silence, occasionally glancing at the empty place at the table. Jack looked at his watch. 8 o'clock. She hadn't called. Finally, the door opened. Kate walked in, her face paler than usual. She threw her bag on the couch and looked at her husband and son. "Sorry I'm late," she said, avoiding their eyes. "The meeting is running late." Jack nodded, but his eyes watched her carefully. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," she answered too quickly. "I'm just tired." Sam snorted but said nothing. He stood up, leaving his plate on the table, and went to his room. Kate watched him go but didn't call out. Jack walked up to her, stopping a couple of steps away. "You forgot to pick up Sam," he said calmly, but there was steel in his voice. Kate flinched, her eyes widening for a second. "Damn, I'm sorry. I really didn't mean to." "I know," he replied, but his tone did not soften. "Just tell me if something is wrong." She opened her mouth to answer, but then just shook her head. "It's okay, Jack. Really." He looked at her for another second, then nodded and returned to the table to clear the dishes. Kate remained standing, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her dress. The house was quiet, but that silence was louder than any words. Kate sat at her desk in a small office on the second floor of the college. The window was open, and cool autumn air blew in, bringing with it the scent of fallen leaves and a distant campfire. On the desk in front of her was a stack of college essays covered in red marks. She tried to concentrate, but her eyes kept drifting to her phone, lying face down. She knew there was probably a message from Jack or Sam, but she didn't want to open it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard of her laptop. She was supposed to be preparing a lecture for tomorrow, something about symbolism in Macbeth, but her thoughts were in a tangle. Instead of Shakespeare, Jack's words from that morning kept popping into her head. Just tell me if something is wrong. His voice, calm as always, but with that subtle edge of steel she knew so well. He didn't shout, didn't demand explanations. And that was the worst part. If he'd been angry, if he'd raised his voice even once, she might have felt alive. But Jack was like his blueprints. Precise, without a single unnecessary line. The office door creaked, and Kate jumped. Liam Brooks stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee from the cafe across the street. His dark green sweater had ridden up a bit, revealing a strip of skin above the waistband of his jeans. He smiled that smile that seemed both boyish and dangerous. "Are you still here?" he asked, walking in uninvited. "I thought you'd run off home to your perfect husband and perfect son." Kate rolled her eyes, but the corners of her lips twitched involuntarily. "Very funny, Liam. What are you doing here?" He placed 1 cup in front of her, ignoring her question. "A latte, just the way you like it, with a splash of vanilla." He sat on the edge of her desk, too close for it to be a friendly gesture. "You look like you need more caffeine than I do." Kate took the cup, inhaling the warm aroma. Her fingers brushed his hand as she took the coffee, and she felt a slight tingle run across her skin. She quickly looked away, but Liam seemed to notice. He always did. "Thank you," she muttered, taking a sip. "But I'm really busy. I have a lecture tomorrow, and I'm not ready yet." "You're always ready, Kate," he said, leaning a little closer. His voice was quieter, almost intimate. "You just don't let yourself relax. When was the last time you did something for yourself?" She looked at him, and for a second she was tempted to tell him everything. How she was suffocating in her perfect home, how every day was like the last, how she felt like a shadow of herself. But instead, she just shrugged. "I'm not complaining, Liam. I'm doing fine." He squinted, as if trying to see something in her eyes. "Okay?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made her heart beat faster. "Kate, you're not the kind of person who lives well. You're the kind of person who's supposed to burn. And right now, you're smoldering." His words struck a chord inside her. She felt her cheeks heat up and quickly turned away, pretending to straighten the papers on her desk. "You read too much poetry," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "It's all your romantic nonsense." Liam laughed, but he didn't back down. He slid off the table and stood next to her, so close she could feel the heat from his body. Her breathing hitched, and she was angry with herself for it. She was married. She had a son. She had what anyone would call a perfect life. But Liam looked at her as if he saw not a literature teacher, not Jack Harper's wife, but a woman who still had the potential to be something more. "Let's go," he said suddenly, holding out his hand to her. "Enough of sitting in this dusty office. Let's go for a walk." Kate hesitated. She knew she should say no. She should pack her things, go home, make dinner, apologize to Sam for forgetting to pick him up. But instead, she nodded. "Okay, just not for long. Now it's your turn, right where you're from, and share your interesting stories in the comments." They walked down a back of campus alley lined with old maple trees, their leaves turning red. Liam was talking about something light, a new book he was reading, a student trying to turn in an essay he'd written with 5 minutes to spare. Kate listened, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about how long it had been since she'd felt so alive. Liam was younger than her, only 3 years, but there was something about his energy, the way he spoke, moved, and laughed that she missed. He wasn't like Jack, who was always in control. Liam was chaotic, unpredictable, and she found that magnetic. They stopped by a small pond, where the bare branches of the trees were reflected. Liam sat down on a bench, motioning for her to sit next to him. Kate sat, but kept her distance, her hands clasped in her lap. Why are you so afraid? He asked suddenly, looking at the water. Afraid? She asked again, frowning. I'm not afraid. You're afraid, he said, turning to face her. His eyes were serious, without their usual mockery. You're afraid to be yourself. Afraid to want something that doesn't fit into your ideal world. Kate opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck. She felt her throat tighten, as if the truth she had been trying so hard to hide was suddenly about to come out. You don't know what you're talking about, she said finally, but her voice trembled. Liam leaned closer, his hand brushing her shoulder. It was a light touch, but it burned like fire. I know you're unhappy, Kate, he said quietly, and I know you deserve better. She should have pushed him away. She should have gotten up and walked away. But instead, she stood there, looking into his eyes. There was something in them she couldn't explain, a mixture of understanding and defiance. And when he leaned in even closer, she didn't pull away. Their lips met, and for a second the world disappeared. His kiss was soft but insistent, and Kate felt her body respond, as if waking from a long sleep. Her hands moved to his neck of their own accord, her fingers tangling in his hair. She could feel the heat of his skin, hear his breath, and it was so wrong, but so necessary. They pulled away after a few seconds, both breathing hard. Kate looked at him, her heart pounding, her mind a whirlwind of excitement and guilt. She knew she had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. But at that moment, she couldn't think about Jack, about Sam, about her perfect home in Vermont. All that mattered was Liam, his hands, his voice, the look in his eyes that promised her a life she didn't have. Kate, he began, but she shook her head. Don't say anything, she whispered. Please. He nodded, but his hand remained on her shoulder, and the touch was like an anchor, keeping her in this moment. It was dark when Kate got home. She entered the house quietly, hoping that Jack and Sam would be asleep. But the light was on in the living room, and Jack was sitting on the couch with his laptop on his lap. His eyes looked up at her, and there was no anger in them, only weariness. You're late, he said, closing the laptop. Yes, she replied, taking off her coat. I was held up at the department store. He nodded, but his gaze lingered on her a little longer than usual. Kate felt her cheeks heat up and turned away, pretending to search her bag for something. Sam asked about you, Jack added. He was expecting you to help him with his biology project. Guilt hit her like a slap. She forgot. Again. I'll talk to him tomorrow, she said, trying to keep her voice even. Jack stood up, walking towards her. He stopped a few steps away, and Kate felt her body tense. Kate, he began, his voice as calm as ever. If you don't want to talk, I won't push you. But I can tell something's wrong. She looked at him, and for a second she wanted to tell him everything. About Liam, about the kiss, about how she was suffocating in this life. But instead, she just shook her head. I'm just tired, Jack. That's all. He looked at her for another second, then nodded and went upstairs. Kate was left standing in the living room, her fingers still remembering Liam's warmth, her heart clenched with a feeling she couldn't name. The next few days were a blur. Kate kept going to work, teaching classes, grading essays. But every time she saw Liam, her world narrowed to his smile, his voice, his casual touch. They began meeting more often after classes, in cafes, in his small apartment near campus. Each time, she told herself that this was the last time that she would stop, go back to her life. But each time, she returned to him. Liam wasn't like Jack. He talked about books, about dreams, about how he wanted to give up everything and go to Italy, write poetry on the coast. He listened to her when she talked about her fears, about how trapped she felt in her own life. He didn't offer solutions like Jack would have. He was just there, and that was enough. But each time, Kate felt more and more guilty. She saw it in Sam's eyes when he looked at her at dinner, in Jack's silence when he asked where she had been. She knew her life was falling apart, but she couldn't stop. Liam had become her addiction, her salvation, and her curse. One evening, as they lay in his apartment, Kate turned toward him, her hair spread across the pillow. What are we doing, Liam? She asked quietly. He smiled, running his finger down her cheek. "We're alive, Kate. For the first time in a long time, you're alive." She wanted to believe him, but deep down she knew this wasn't living. It was running, and sooner or later she would have to stop. Jack Harper had always had an eye for detail. It was his professional habit to see how lines on a drawing formed a structure, how the slightest miscalculation could destroy the entire building. He carried this skill over into his life. He analyzed, compared, drew conclusions. But now he was looking not at the sketches, but at Kate, and what he saw made his internal compass tremble like a needle before a storm. The morning began as usual. Jack woke up at 6, ran 3 miles through the quiet streets of their rural Vermont neighborhood, showered, and made breakfast. Kate came down later, her hair still damp from the shower, her face paler than usual. She wore the navy dress he always thought was her favorite, but today it felt foreign to her, as if she'd put it on to hide. Sam was already sitting at the table, picking at his toast and staring at his phone. "Good morning," Jack said, placing a cup of coffee in front of Kate. Black, with a drop of milk, just the way she liked it. "Morning," she said, not looking up. Her fingers were fiddling nervously with the edge of her napkin, and Jack noticed it. He also noticed how she quickly put her phone back in her bag when he walked into the kitchen. "Are you picking up Sam today?" he asked, slicing an apple for his son. Kate nodded, sipping her coffee. "Yes, at 4. I only have 2 lectures." Sam snorted, not looking up from the screen. "Yeah, like last time." Kate tensed, her shoulders shaking slightly. Jack noticed the movement, but didn't show it. He continued cutting the apple, his knife moving smoothly, without a single unnecessary movement. "I won't forget, Sam," she said, her voice a mixture of guilt and irritation. "I promise." The teenager shrugged but said nothing. He grabbed his backpack and ran out of the kitchen, saying a short bye. The door slammed and the house went quiet. Jack looked at Kate. She sat staring into her cup, her fingers still clutching her napkin. He wanted to ask what was going on, but instead he said, "Are you okay?" She looked up at him, and for a second he thought she was going to say something. But then her gaze went blank, as if she had closed the door. "Yes, everything is fine," she answered, standing up. "I have to go." She left, leaving her cup half empty. Jack watched her go, his gaze lingering on her bag lying on the couch. He didn't check her phone, it wasn't his style. But he saw the screen light up and a notification flash across it. The sender's name was short, Liam. In his office, Jack sat at his desk, surrounded by blueprints for a new project, an apartment complex on the outskirts of town. His team had been discussing the details for a week, but today he couldn't concentrate. His thoughts kept returning to Kate, to her distant gaze, to her half-drunk coffee, to the name on her phone screen. Liam. He knew he was a colleague of hers, a philosophy professor or something. They'd met a few times at college events, smiling, charming, with that relaxed manner of speaking that irritated Jack. But he'd never thought of him as a problem. Until now. Jack opened his laptop and began to scroll through the project, but his fingers froze over the keyboard. He remembered Kate coming home later than usual last week, her cheeks slightly pink, her perfume a little stronger than usual. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now the details fit together in his head like puzzle pieces. Her late arrivals, her silence at dinner, her habit of hiding her phone. And Liam. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. His office was spacious, with large windows looking out onto the green hills of Vermont. He loved this place, it was his sanctuary, a place where everything was logical and orderly. But now that order was crumbling, and he could feel it. Jack was not a confrontational man. He did not shout, he did not make scenes. His strength was in observation, in the ability to wait. He knew that if something was happening, the truth would eventually come out, and he was willing to wait. Kate sat in the classroom, finishing her lecture on Macbeth. She sounded confident, but inside she felt her nerves tense as strings. The students were taking notes, some yawning, some looking out the window. She tried to concentrate, but her thoughts kept returning to Liam, to his hands, to his voice, to the way he had looked at her last night in his flat. She felt alive with him, but every time she went home she was drowning in guilt. After the lecture, she gathered her things and went out into the hallway. Liam was waiting for her at the door, leaning against the wall. His dark sweater was slightly wrinkled, and he was holding a book in his hands, a tattered edition of Nietzsche. "You look like you're ready to run away," he said, smiling. Kate shook her head, but her lips twitched involuntarily. "And you look like you just escaped from the library." He laughed, and the sound made her heart beat faster. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't help it. "Let's go," he said, nodding towards the exit. "I have an hour before the next lecture. Let's have some coffee." Kate wanted to refuse, but instead nodded. They left the building and headed to a cafe across campus. It had become their ritual short encounters that seemed innocent, but each time pulled her deeper. The cafe was noisy, students chatting at nearby tables, the barista shouting out orders. Kate and Liam sat by the window, and she watched him stir sugar into his espresso. His movements were light, almost casual, but there was something seductively confident about them. "You're kind of quiet today," he said, looking at her over his cup. "Did something happen?" Kate shrugged, looking out the window. "It's just, everything is complicated." "Complicated?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him. "Kate, you don't have to live in complicated. You can choose something else." She felt her throat tighten. He made it sound like it was simple, like she could just rewrite her life. But she had Jack, Sam, the home they were building together. And yet, when she looked at Liam, she wanted to believe he was right. "I don't know how," she said quietly. "I don't know what I want." Liam leaned closer, his hand brushing against hers on the table. It was a light touch, but it burned. "You know," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "you're just afraid to admit it." Kate felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to pull away, but instead her fingers tightened around his hand. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't think about Jack or Sam at that moment. She could only think about Liam, about how he made her feel alive. Jack picked Sam up from school at 4. The teenager was sitting in the back seat, staring at his phone. Jack glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Mom hasn't arrived?" Sam asked, not looking up from the screen. "She's busy," Jack answered, trying to keep his voice neutral. "She has lectures." Sam chuckled but said nothing. Jack noticed his son's lips tighten, as if he wanted to say something but thought better of it. He knew Sam could sense the tension between him and Kate. The teenager was too smart not to notice. When they got home, Jack started making dinner. He chopped vegetables for the salad, his movements precise as always. But his mind was elsewhere. He remembered Kate coming home yesterday, her coat smelling not just of her perfume, but of something else, something sharp, masculine. He noticed how she quickly put her phone away when he walked into the room, and how her eyes avoided his. He wasn't paranoid. He didn't want to be the kind of husband who went through his wife's things. But he couldn't ignore the facts, and the facts said something had changed. It was 7 o'clock when Kate returned home. She walked into the kitchen, her cheeks slightly pink, as if she had been in a hurry. Jack noticed that her dress was slightly wrinkled, and her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, as if she had fixed it in a hurry. "Sorry," she said, putting her bag on a chair. "I was held up at a meeting." Jack nodded, not looking up from his salad. "Everything is fine," he said. "Dinner is almost ready." Kate looked at him, and for a second he thought she wanted to say something. But then she just nodded and went upstairs to change. Dinner was quiet. Sam picked at his food, Kate stared at her plate, and Jack watched. He noticed everything. The way she avoided his gaze, the way her fingers fidgeted with her fork, the way her phone, lying next to her, lit up with a new message. She quickly turned it face down. "How did the lecture go?" he asked, taking a sip of water. Kate flinched, as if she hadn't expected the question. "It's fine," she replied. "The students, as always, aren't really listening." "Yeah," Sam interjected, "especially when you start talking about Shakespeare." Kate smiled, but it was a forced smile. "Maybe you're right," she said, looking at her son. "Maybe I should read them comics." Sam snorted, but his eyes remained serious. Jack noticed it. He also noticed how Kate quickly changed the subject, asking Sam about his biology project. But the teenager answered monosyllabically and soon went back to his room. When they were alone, Jack began to clear away the dishes. Kate stood up to help, but he stopped her. "I can handle it," he said. "Rest." She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes he couldn't quite place. Guilt, fear, or just tiredness? "Thank you," she muttered and went into the living room. Jack watched her go, his hands methodically stacking plates in the dishwasher. He didn't know what to do with what he saw, but he knew he wouldn't rush. He would watch and wait. The next day, Jack decided to go to the college to pick up Kate. He didn't tell her. That wasn't his style. He just wanted to see her, talk to her, maybe understand. It was dark when he parked outside the main building. There were lights on in a few windows, and he spotted her silhouette in one of them. She was standing at a table, and there was someone else next to her. A man, tall, with wild blonde hair. Liam. Jack sat in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He saw Liam lean toward Kate, his hand brushing her shoulder. It was a light touch, but it told Jack all he needed to know. He didn't get out of the car. He didn't knock on the window. He just watched, his face calm, but something coiling inside him like a spring. When Kate left the building, he was already gone. She didn't know he was there, and he wasn't going to tell her. Not yet. It had begun to rain late in the afternoon, a steady, light rain that covered the Vermont streets in a thin, damp film. The Harper windows were slightly open, and the sound of raindrops pattering on the sills mingled with the low hum of the television in the living room. Kate sat cross-legged on the couch, her laptop in her lap. She pretended to be checking students' essays, but her eyes kept drifting to her phone next to her. The screen lit up every few minutes, and each time her fingers paused, as if she were deciding whether to answer. Sam was lying on the floor, his nose buried in a biology book. His headphones were lying nearby, and he was clearly not listening to music, but to the silence that filled the house. Jack was in his office upstairs, working on a project. His footsteps occasionally echoed through the ceiling, steady like a metronome. Sam hated the silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was something heavy, like the air in the house had grown thicker. Kate picked up the phone, quickly glancing at the screen. A message from Liam. "Today at 7, I have wine and a new playlist." Her lips twitched into a small smile, but she quickly suppressed it, glancing at Sam. He wasn't looking at her, but she felt like he was seeing more than he was letting on. She wrote a short reply, "I'm not sure. I'll tell you later," and put the phone in her jeans pocket. "Sam," she called, trying to keep her voice light. "Are you finished with the project?" He raised his head, his dark eyes serious, almost adult. "Almost there. All that's left is to finish the presentation." "Do you want me to help you?" she offered, closing the laptop. Sam shrugged, his face unreadable. "No need. I can handle it." Kate nodded, feeling something tighten in her chest. Her son was drifting away, and she didn't know how to stop it. She wanted to say something else, but her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she couldn't help but flinch. Sam noticed. His gaze lingered on her a second too long, and she felt her cheeks heat up. "I'll go get some water," she said, standing up. "Do you want anything?" "No," he replied, returning to the book. Kate walked into the kitchen, her fingers shaking as she pulled out her phone. Another text from Liam. "You know what you want. Don't make me wait." She closed her eyes, feeling her heart beat faster. She knew she had to stop. Knew that every step she took with Liam was taking her further away from Jack, from Sam, from the life she'd spent years building. But there was something about Liam that she couldn't let go of: his words, his touch, his ability to see her as the woman she no longer was. She wrote, "Okay, at 7, and hit send before she could change her mind. Then she poured herself some water, took a deep breath, and walked back into the living room. Sam was still lying on the floor, but now he was looking at her, his book set aside. "Who was that?" he asked suddenly, his voice calm, but there was a hint of suspicion in it. Kate froze, her fingers tightening around the glass. "What? You keep checking your phone," he said, sitting up. "And you look weird." She forced herself to smile, but it came out tight. "It's just work, Sam. Students, colleagues. Nothing special." He looked at her, and his eyes were too mature for a 14-year-old boy. She felt her throat tighten. She wanted to tell him the truth, but the truth was too hard, too devastating. "Okay," he said finally, but there was something in his tone that said he didn't believe it. Jack sat in his office, his laptop open to a blueprint of the new building, but he wasn't looking at the screen. His gaze was fixed on the window, where the rain was leaving long streaks on the glass. He was thinking about Kate, about her late arrivals, her distant gaze, the scent of someone else's cologne he'd caught on her coat yesterday. He wasn't a man to act on impulse. He wasn't going to make a scene or demand an explanation, but he couldn't ignore what he was seeing. He opened a drawer and pulled out a business card he had been given at a business dinner a few months earlier. "Robert Klein, private detective," it said on the thick paper. Jack didn't like that kind of thing. It seemed dirty, unworthy. But he also knew that the truth didn't always come by itself. Sometimes you have to look for it. He dialed the number, and after 2 rings, a low, slightly hoarse voice answered. "Klein speaking." "This is Jack Harper," he said, his voice level, without the slightest hint of emotion. "I need your help." "Give me the details," Klein replied, and there was neither curiosity nor surprise in his tone. He was used to such calls. Jack explained everything briefly: his suspicions, Kate's behavior, Liam's name. He didn't mention Sam. It was too personal. Klein listened silently, only occasionally asking clarifying questions. "I'll start tomorrow," he said finally. "Report in a week. No unnecessary words, no traces. Is that all?" "Yes," Jack replied. "Thank you." He hung up and leaned back in his chair. His face remained calm, but inside there was a tightening, as if someone was slowly tightening a screw. He didn't want to do this, but he had to know. Kate left the house at 6:30, throwing a short, "I'm going to a department meeting," to Jack. He nodded, not looking up from his drawings, but his eyes followed her until she disappeared through the door. The rain had picked up, and she turned up the collar of her coat, hurrying toward the car. Her heart was pounding, as if she were running rather than walking. She knew she was doing something wrong, but she couldn't stop. Liam's apartment was 10 minutes away, in an old brick house on the outskirts of town. When she walked in, he was waiting for her, a glass of wine in his hand, and that smile of his that made her forget everything. The room smelled of candles and something tart, maybe his cologne. The music was playing softly, some indie rock she didn't recognize. "You came," he said, handing her a glass. "I thought you'd change your mind again." Kate took the wine, her fingers shaking slightly. "I haven't changed my mind," she replied, but her voice was quieter than she intended. He stepped closer, and she felt her body respond to his closeness. His hand touched her waist, and she didn't pull away. She knew she should, but instead she let him pull her close. His lips found hers, and for a second everything else disappeared: the rain outside, her home, her family. There were only his hands, his breath, his warmth. When they pulled away, she looked at him, her eyes full of a mixture of excitement and fear. "This isn't right, Liam," she whispered. He smiled, but there was something new in his smile, something she couldn't quite place. "Wrong?" he asked, running his finger down her cheek. "Kate, this is the only thing that's right." She wanted to believe him, but deep down she knew he was wrong. Sam sat in his room, his laptop open to a biology presentation, but not working. He listened to the rain on the roof and thought about his mother. She had been acting strange for weeks. Her smiles were too quick, her responses too short, and that phone, she checked it every 5 minutes, and each time her face changed, either with joy or fear. He went downstairs to get some water and heard the front door open. Kate was back sooner than he expected. She was standing in the hallway, shaking the rain off her coat. Her phone rang, and she answered quickly, not noticing Sam. "Liam, I just got back," she said quietly, her voice tight. "Not now, please." Sam paused in the doorway. Liam. He knew the name Mum's coworker, the one who came to their family picnic in the summer. He was too friendly, too close to her. Sam wasn't stupid. He knew something was wrong. Kate ended the call and turned around, finally noticing her son. Her eyes widened, and she quickly put her phone away. "Sam, why aren't you sleeping?" she asked, trying to smile. "I don't want to," he replied, looking into her eyes. "Who is Liam?" Kate froze, her smile disappearing. "A colleague," she said after a pause. "We work together." Sam nodded, but his eyes said he didn't believe her. He turned and went back to his room, leaving her standing in the hallway, the rain falling softly. Jack met Klein 3 days later at a cafe on the outskirts of town. The detective was short, with short gray hair and a tired look. He placed a thin folder on the table and sipped his coffee. "That's all for now," he said, nodding at the file. "She's dating Liam Brooks, the philosophy professor. Flat on Willow Street. They've seen each other there 3 times in the last 2 days." Jack nodded, his face impassive. He opened the folder, but didn't look at the photos. He knew what he would see. "What else?" he asked. "Nothing yet," Klein replied. "But I can dig deeper. Keep an eye on him, on her. Tell me what to do next." Jack shook his head. "Just go on," he said. "I'll handle it myself." Klein nodded and left, leaving the folder on the table. Jack sat for a few more minutes, looking out the window at the rain. He felt no anger, no pain, only a cold, clear determination. He would wait, and he would know. The rain had stopped, leaving a wet sheen on the pavement and the smell of damp earth. The Harper house was quiet, but this silence was different, not tense, as usual, but empty, as if someone had turned off the sound in the room. Jack stood in the kitchen, methodically stacking dishes in the dishwasher. His movements were as precise as ever, but there was a new heaviness to them, as if each gesture required effort. Kate walked in, her hair pulled back into a low ponytail and her book bag in her hands. She looked tired, but her eyes were more alive than they had been in weeks. Jack noticed it, as he noticed everything. He closed the dishwasher and turned to face her, drying his hands on a towel. "We need to talk," he said, his voice even, without a hint of emotion. Kate froze, her fingers tightening on the strap of her bag. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but she still wasn't ready. She nodded, sitting down at the table. "About what?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Jack sat down opposite her, his gaze direct but not accusing. He folded his hands on the table, and Kate watched as his fingers flexed slightly before relaxing. "I think we need to take a break," he said. "I'm going away with Sam for a couple of weeks to visit my sister in Maine. You need time to figure out what you want." Kate felt her throat tighten. She had expected anger, questions, and accusations, but not this. Not this calm, almost surgical solution. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words did not come. "Jack, she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "You don't have to explain, Kate," he said. "Not now. Just think. About us. About Sam. About what's important to you." His words were like a blow, not a sharp one, but a slow, penetrating one. She nodded, unable to meet his gaze. She knew he saw more than he said, and that was what scared her most. "When are you leaving?" she asked quietly. "Tomorrow morning," he replied. "I've already told Sam. He agrees." Kate felt her heart clench. Sam. She hadn't even thought about how he would take it. She wanted to ask what he'd said to his son, but she didn't dare. Instead, she just nodded. "Okay," she said. I'll be here." Jack looked at her for a second longer, then stood up and walked out of the kitchen. His steps were as even as ever, but Kate felt something inside her crack, like thin ice beneath her feet. The next morning, Jack and Sam left. Kate stood by the window, watching their car disappear around the corner. Sam was in the back seat, staring at his phone, but before he got in, he glanced at her, briefly, but full of questions she didn't know how to answer. Jack, as always, was calm. He didn't say anything unnecessary, just briefly hugged her goodbye. His hands were warm, but there was no intimacy in his touch, only habit. When the car was out of sight, Kate walked back into the house. The silence was deafening. She walked into the living room, sat down on the couch, and closed her eyes. Her phone was on the table, and she knew there was a text from Liam on it. She didn't want to open it right away, but her fingers slid toward the screen. "Are you free today? Come over." The message read. Kate felt her pulse quicken. She wrote a short reply, "Yes, in the evening," and put the phone away. She should have felt guilty. She should have thought about Jack, about Sam, about what she was destroying. But instead, she felt light, like someone had lifted an invisible weight off her. 2 weeks. 2 weeks without having to pretend, without having to hide her phone, without having to explain. She could be herself, or at least the version of herself she wanted to be. Kate arrived at Liam's place at 7. His flat was the same as always. Cozy, slightly chaotic, with books scattered on the shelves, vinyl records on the turntable, and the smell of coffee that seemed to permeate everything. He opened the door barefoot, wearing a dark t-shirt and soft home pants. In his hands were a bottle of red wine and 2 glasses. "You look free," he said, pouring wine. "Has something changed?" Kate took the glass, their fingers brushing for a moment. The simple contact was unexpectedly powerful. She felt her body respond, not just physically, but with her entire being. "Jack's gone away," she said, taking a sip. "With Sam, for a couple of weeks." Liam narrowed his eyes, his smile growing wider, warmer. But there was no triumph in it, only acceptance. "Then we have time," he said, putting down his glass. "Time for you." He came closer, and she did not pull away. His hands settled on her waist, slid slowly up her back, and there was no rush in the movement, only attention, almost awe. She took a deep breath. "I don't want to talk about home," she said quietly. "I'm not asking," he replied. "I just want to feel alive. Then let me remind you who you are." He kissed her, at first gently, as if testing the boundaries. But when she responded, stepped closer, tucked her fingers into his hair, everything flowed faster, hotter, closer to the edge. Their breaths mingled, and the wine was forgotten. They found themselves on the couch, then in the bedroom. Words were unnecessary, but they still spoke whispered, almost scratching each other with their voices. "Your hands," Kate whispered, arching her back into his. "It's like they know what I was missing." "I listen to you, Kate. All of you, even when you're silent." "Aren't you afraid of intimacy?" she breathed out, pressing herself against him. "No, I'm afraid of not being there when you suddenly open up." She pressed her cheek against him, hot and wet, his breath pounding against her neck. "Do you feel it?" she asked. "Like I'm falling apart and coming back together again." "I feel," he whispered, "and I want you to know that you are not a thing. You are not a function. You are not a role. You are a desire, a force. You are real." They spent the night as if in oblivion. No plans, no promises, just passion, skin, laughter, tears, and a quiet stay that no one said, but both understood. That night, they lay in his bed, the streetlights shining through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls. Liam was asleep, his breathing even, his arm around her waist. Kate stared at the ceiling, and the thoughts she had so carefully pushed away began to return. She thought of Jack, his calm voice, his suggestion to think about it. She thought of Sam, his gaze growing more distant, and she felt the happiness she had felt with Liam begin to seem thin, like glass ready to crack under the slightest pressure. The next few days passed in a blur. Kate spent them with Liam, and each day felt like a small holiday. They walked through parks, drank coffee in small cafes, sat in his apartment, listening to music and talking until late at night. Liam was light as the wind, and with him she felt younger, freer, more alive. He didn't ask about her family, didn't remind her of what she had left behind. He was here now, and that was enough. One day they drove out of town to a lake surrounded by pine trees. It was chilly, and Kate huddled in his jacket as they sat on the bank, looking out at the water. Liam was telling her about his plans to write a book, something about the philosophy of love, about how people find meaning in each other. Kate listened, and her heart sank because she knew he was talking about her, or at least the version of her he had seen. "Have you ever thought about giving it all up?" he asked suddenly, looking at the lake. "Leave? Start over?" Kate smiled, but her smile was bitter. "Where to?" she asked. "And with whom?" He turned to face her, his eyes serious. "With me," he said. "We could go anywhere, Italy, Greece, even to the ends of the earth." She laughed, but the laugh was forced. "Liam, it's not that simple." "Why?" he asked, and there was a hint of challenge in his voice. "Because you're afraid, or because you don't want to?" Kate didn't answer. She looked at the water, her thoughts in a tangle. She wanted to believe that she could be like this free light, the one who went to the ends of the earth with a man who looked at her like she was a miracle. But deep down, she knew it was an illusion, that her life wasn't just about herself, but about Sam and Jack and the house they were building together. Meanwhile, Jack and Sam were in Maine, at Jack's sister Abby's small house. The house was old, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot and a view of the ocean. Abby was a woman with a loud laugh and warm eyes, and she immediately took care of Sam, making him eat homemade pie and talk about school. Sam was reserved, but Jack could see that he was comfortable here, that he was relaxing in a way he didn't do at home. Jack spent his days walking along the beach or helping Abby with small repairs. He didn't talk about Kate, and Abby didn't ask. She knew his brother. He never shared what was bothering him until he was ready. But she saw the way his eyes sometimes lingered, as if he were looking somewhere far away beyond the horizon. Sam, on the other hand, was more open. One evening, as they sat on the veranda watching the sunset, he turned to his father. "Mom is always on the phone," he said suddenly. "Have you noticed?" Jack nodded, his face remaining calm. "Yes," he replied, "I noticed." "It's about Liam, isn't it?" Sam asked, his voice a mixture of anger and pain. "She talks to him all the time." Jack looked at his son, and his heart sank. He didn't want Sam to know more than he needed to. He didn't want him to feel this pain, but he couldn't lie. "Perhaps," he said, "but it's none of your business, Sam. It's between Mom and me." Sam nodded, but his eyes were full of questions. He turned away, looking out at the ocean, and Jack felt something inside him crack. He wanted to protect his son, but he didn't know how. Kate came home late after another night with Liam. The house was empty, and the emptiness felt both liberating and terrifying. She went into the bedroom, lay down on the bed, and closed her eyes. She felt good with Liam, but the happiness was shallow, like glitter on water. She knew it wouldn't last. She knew she would have to make a choice soon. But for now, she allowed herself to drown in this illusory world where there was no Jack, no Sam, no guilt eating away at her from the inside. She didn't know that Jack had already received a new report from Klein. Photos, messages, addresses. He didn't look at them, but he knew they were there, in a folder on his desk. He was waiting, and he was ready. The cold wind off the ocean cut into his bones, but Jack ignored it. He stood on the porch of his sister's house in Maine, watching the gray waves crash against the rocks. He held the phone in his hand, and the lawyer's voice, dry and businesslike, was on the other end of the line. Jack listened intently, his face still, as if he were studying a blueprint rather than discussing the end of his marriage. "Everything is in place," said the lawyer, Mark Reed, a man of repute who asked no questions. "The custody and property division papers are in place. The assets have been transferred to your name as you requested. I've also included your detective's materials in the file. In Vermont, adultery affects property division and custody, so we're in a strong position. When do you want to file for divorce?" Jack gripped the phone a little tighter, but his voice remained even. "As soon as I get back. In 3 days." "Okay," Mark replied. "I'll have everything ready for your arrival. If she doesn't contest it, the process will be quick." Jack nodded, although the lawyer couldn't see him. "Thank you, Mark. I'll get in touch with you." He hung up and stuffed the phone into his jacket pocket. In the distance, Sam was throwing rocks into the water, his thin shoulders tense as if he were trying to express something he couldn't put into words. Jack looked at his son, his heart clenching. He didn't want Sam to be a hostage to this war, but he knew there was no other way. Kate had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to pretend that nothing had changed. Over the past 2 weeks, Jack had been methodical. He had met with Klein again, receiving a detailed report. Photos of Kate and Liam leaving his apartment, the correspondence the detective had obtained through his own channels, addresses and dates. Jack hadn't looked at the photos. Klein's words were enough. He had also contacted the bank and transferred the main assets, the house, savings, investments into his own name to protect them in the event of a divorce. He knew Vermont law. Infidelity could affect the division of property, and he wasn't about to leave that to chance. It was all done quietly, as he was accustomed to. But Sam was his main concern. Jack wanted full custody, not because he didn't trust Kate as a mother, but because he saw how her behavior hurt her son. Sam became more and more withdrawn. His questions about his mother became less frequent, but Jack knew he saw everything and felt everything. "Dad," Sam called, coming closer. His sneakers were wet from the spray, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. "Are we going home soon?" Jack looked at him, trying to keep his voice calm. "In a couple of days," he said. "Do you want to stay longer?" Sam shrugged, his gaze fixed on the water. "I don't know. It's fine here, but I miss home." Jack nodded, feeling something tighten in his chest. He wanted to tell his son that everything would be okay, but he couldn't. Instead, he put his hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll figure it out, Sam. I promise." Sam looked at him, a mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. He nodded and went back to throwing rocks into the water with more force than necessary. Kate sat in a cafe across campus, staring at her empty cup of coffee. Liam sat across from her, his fingers twirling his spoon idly. He was talking about something, a new course he wanted to start, a book he was reading, but she was barely listening. Her mind was elsewhere, in the empty house, in the conversation with Jack before he left, in Sam's eyes as he looked at her like he knew more than he was saying. The last 2 weeks had been a dream. Without Jack and Sam, she felt free, but it was a freedom as fragile as glass. Liam was there, and with him she could forget about the guilt, the pain, the fact that her life was falling apart. But today, something was different. Liam was as charming as ever, but his smile seemed less sincere, his touch less warm. And when he spoke, his eyes slid past her, as if he were already somewhere else. "Liam," she said suddenly, cutting him off. "Are you okay?" He looked at her, his eyebrows raised slightly. "Of course," he replied, but there was a slight tension in his voice. "And you?" Kate shrugged, trying to smile. "It's just all of this. Me. Do you ever think about where this is all leading?" Liam leaned back in his chair, his fingers stopping twirling the spoon. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a cold calculation masked by familiar warmth. "Kate," he said, his voice soft but steely, "let's not make this complicated. We're having a good time, aren't we? Why think about the future?" Her heart sank. She opened her mouth to reply, but at that moment the waitress came to their table and Liam turned to her, smiling his usual charming smile. Kate looked at him, her thoughts jumbled. She remembered him talking about moving away together, about a new life, about love changing everything. But now his words seemed empty, like an echo in an empty room. When the waitress left, Kate leaned closer. "Liam, you're married," she said quietly, but her voice was shaking. "You said it didn't matter, that you'd leave. Is that true?" He looked at her, and for a second his face went still, like a mask. Then he smiled, but it was a different smile, condescending, almost mocking. "Kate, you didn't think I was serious, did you?" he said. "I have a family. Kids. I'm not going to give it all up for this." The word "this" hit her like a slap. She felt her cheeks flush, as if he had just ripped her skin off. She looked at him, trying to find in his eyes some hint of the Liam who had promised her the world, but all she saw was indifference. "So I was. An adventure, she asked, her voice barely audible. Liam shrugged, his smile softening, but it only made his words hurt more. Not an adventure, Kate. You're special. But life is life. You understand. She didn't understand. She felt her world crumbling, everything she had risked her family, her marriage, her son for was a lie. She stood up, her hands shaking as she grabbed her coat. I have to go, she said without looking at him. Kate, wait, he began, but she had already left without turning around. Kate returned home, her coat wet from the light rain that had begun again. The house was empty, and the emptiness weighed on her like a slab of concrete. She walked into the living room, sat on the sofa, and covered her face with her hands. Her thoughts swirled like leaves in the wind. Liam, Jack, Sam. She had ruined everything for a man for whom she was nothing more than a temporary distraction. She remembered Liam's words, his smile, his touch, and her stomach clenched in disgust, not for him, but for herself. She pulled out her phone to text Jack, but stopped. What could she say? I'm sorry I made a mistake. I want it all back. She knew he wouldn't forgive. Jack wasn't the type to forgive betrayal. She'd seen it in his eyes before he left a cold, unyielding determination. Her thoughts were interrupted by the doorbell. She jumped, not expecting guests. The courier, a young guy in a raincoat, stood on the threshold with an envelope in his hands. Kate Harper? He asked. She nodded, her heart pounding. The messenger handed her an envelope and walked away, leaving her standing in the rain. She went back into the house, her fingers shaking as she opened it. Inside were papers, a divorce petition. Jack had listed infidelity as the reason, and every word of the document was like a knife stabbing her chest. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the lines. Custody of Sam, division of property, a list of assets that now belonged to Jack. He had thought of it all. He had prepared it all. And he hadn't said a word to her. Kate sank to the floor, the papers slipping from her hands. She felt her world crumbling, and this time Liam wasn't there to distract her from the pain. She was alone, and the scale of the destruction she had caused washed over her like a wave. She thought of Sam, the look in his eyes, the questions she couldn't answer. She thought of Jack, his calm that now felt less like a strength and more like a sentence. She sat on the floor as the rain pounded the windows, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to cry. The rain had stopped, but the air in the Harper house was damp and cold, as if nature itself refused to warm the place. Kate sat on the living room floor, surrounded by the scattered pages of the envelope the courier had delivered. The divorce papers lay before her, the words on the pages seeming to have been cut from her own life. Infidelity, full custody, division of property. Each word was a blow, as precise and merciless as everything Jack had ever done. She cried no more. Her tears had dried up, leaving behind only an emptiness that was heavier than any grief. Her phone was lying next to her, the screen dark. She knew she had to call Jack, try to explain, try to stop this. It was all happening too fast or too late. She dialed his number, and her heart began pounding so loudly she thought he could hear it, even from a distance. After 3 rings, he answered. Kate, he said. No, hello, no, how are you? Just her name, as a statement of fact. She swallowed, her throat dry. Jack, I received the documents. A pause, so long that she thought he had hung up. Can we talk, please? About what? His voice was even, but there was a heaviness behind this calm. You made your choice. It's not like that, she said quickly, almost choking on her words. I was wrong. I didn't mean for it to end this way. But that's how it ended. You don't even want to hear why. I don't need it. Kate, I tried. For months. For years, to be honest. But you weren't there for me anymore, even when you were sitting next to me. I didn't know how to get back, she whispered. I just wanted to feel something. Anything. And did you feel it? Now there was a sharp note in her voice. With him, it wasn't. She trailed off. It wasn't about him. It was about me disappearing. I didn't want to disappear. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to watch the person you love dissolve before your eyes, and you can't do anything about it? Jack. No, it's too late, Kate. I'll be back tomorrow with Sam. My lawyer will contact you. Anything that needs to be discussed, we'll discuss through him. Wait, she almost screamed. Please, just, not through a lawyer. I still want us to be able to, at least talk, without protection, without war. He exhaled, heavily, silently. You know what's most offensive? He asked, almost in a whisper. I would forgive, not right away, but I could, if you had come earlier, before everything became a lie. Kate was silent. Her chest was burning. And now, she whispered. And now I don't believe it anymore, he replied. Neither you, nor myself next to you. So that's it. Yes, that's all. And he passed out. Kate was left holding the phone, and suddenly it felt heavy as a stone. She wanted to call back, to scream, to beg, but she knew it was Jack. If he said everything that means so. She slowly placed the phone on the table, then covered her face with her hands. The room around her was quiet, cozy, and alien. She stood up, her legs shaking as if the floor beneath her was unstable. The house felt foreign, too big, too empty. She walked into the kitchen, where the plates from the last dinner they had eaten together still sat. She remembered the way Sam had looked at her, his eyes full of questions she couldn't answer. She remembered Jack, his calm that now seemed not a strength to her, but a wall she couldn't break through. Her gaze fell on the refrigerator where a photo hung, the three of them at the lake 2 years ago. Sam, still a child, laughing, holding a fishing rod. Jack stood nearby, his arm around his son's shoulder, and Kate smiled, clinging to him. Things had been simpler then, or at least they had seemed that way. She turned away, feeling her chest tighten with panic. She was losing everything. The husband who had been her rock, even if she hadn't always appreciated it. The son who looked at her with pain she had caused. The house that had been their refuge, but now belonged only to Jack. And the reputation she knew the rumors were already spreading. The next day, Kate drove to college, hoping work would help distract her. But the campus that had always felt alive and familiar to her now felt hostile. Students whispered as she passed, their glances curious and judgmental. She heard snatches of conversation. With a colleague, his wife. Poor husband. She knew Liam wasn't being careful. He was telling his friends, bragging, maybe even laughing, and she was too blind to notice. In the staff room, she was met with the cold gaze of Marge, the elderly English teacher who had always been friendly. Now her lips were pursed and her eyes avoided Kate. Good morning, Kate said, trying to smile. Marge just nodded, not looking up from her papers. Morning, she answered, and her voice was dry as autumn leaves. Kate felt her cheeks heat up. She walked to her desk, trying not to look at her colleagues. She knew the rumors had reached the department. Liam was married, and his wife, Anna, worked at a nearby university. Someone had probably told her, and now Kate was the one who had broken up the family. No one said it out loud, but she felt it in every look, in every silence. Her lecture was a blur. The students were distracted, and she couldn't blame them. She herself was barely holding on, her voice shaking as she tried to talk about Emily Dickinson's poetry. After class, she was left in the room, gathering her things, when Liam walked in. His hair was a mess, but his smile, which had once seemed like a salvation to her, now looked fake. Kate, he began, but she raised her hand, stopping him. Don't, she said, her voice firm despite the pain inside. I know everything. You never intended to leave Anna. Liam sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. Kate, I didn't mean for you to think that. You used me, she interrupted, her eyes flashing. I destroyed my family for you, and you were just having fun. He opened his mouth to object, but then just shrugged. I'm sorry, he said, and there was no sincerity in his voice. But you made your own choice. Kate felt her fists clench. She wanted to scream, to hit him, but instead she turned and walked out, leaving him standing in the empty classroom. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway, every sound a reminder of what she had lost. Kate returned home, but the house was no longer hers. She knew Jack had transferred it to himself, and the paperwork showed that. She was sitting in the living room when a letter from her lawyer arrived, an official divorce notice, with the first hearing scheduled in 2 weeks. The letter also talked about custody. Jack was seeking full custody of Sam, citing her inappropriate behavior and emotional instability. She read the words, and each one was like a knife, stabbing deeper. She tried calling Sam, but he didn't answer. She texted him, "Sam, please talk to me. I miss you." But there was no answer. She knew he was with Jack, and that Jack had probably already told him his version of the truth. She couldn't blame her son for pulling away. She was the one who had pushed him away. Desperate, she drove to Jack's sister's house in Maine. She knew it was a bad idea, but she needed to see Sam to explain, to try to make things right. When she pulled up, Abby opened the door. Her face was kind, but there was a hardness in her eyes. "Kate," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Sam doesn't want to see you. Not now." Kate felt her throat tighten. "Please, Abby," she said, her voice shaking. "I just want to talk to him." Abby shook her head. "Give him time," she said. "You made a choice, and now he has to live with it. Let him figure it out." Kate was about to protest, but she saw Sam standing in the doorway behind Abby. His eyes were dark, full of pain and anger. He looked at her, and there was nothing in that look except disappointment. "Sam," she began, but he turned and walked away without saying a word. Abby placed her hand on Kate's shoulder. "Go home," she said quietly. "That's all you can do now." Kate nodded, her eyes filling with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She got into her car and drove away, feeling her world shrink to a point of no return. Back in Vermont, Kate found that the rumors at college had grown louder. Her colleagues avoided her, students whispered behind her back. The department chair called her in for a talk, politely but firmly hinting that her reputation could affect my job. He didn't say outright that she might be fired, but Kate got the hint. Her career, her passion for teaching, everything she'd spent years building, was crumbling like a house of cards. She came back to a house that wasn't her home anymore. She sat in the living room, looking at the picture on the refrigerator, and felt panic wash over her. She'd lost Jack, who'd been her anchor, even if she hadn't always appreciated it. She'd lost Sam, who'd been her heart. She'd lost the home that had been her sanctuary, and now she was losing herself, the woman she'd once been, the one who'd believed in love, in family, in the future. She picked up her phone and texted Jack, "Please give me a chance to explain everything." But there was no answer. She knew there wouldn't be one. Jack wasn't the type to come back, and she was the one who had destroyed everything they had. Kate lay down on the couch, closing her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her pain. The house was empty, and she was empty with it. The Burlington courtroom was small, but its sterile cleanliness and cool fluorescent lighting made it feel as if the walls were closing in on anyone who entered. The wooden benches smelled of old varnish, and the footsteps of the lawyers and law clerks echoed on the linoleum. Kate sat at a table next to her attorney, a middle-aged woman named Linda Crow, whose wire-rimmed glasses and tailored suit seemed an extension of her clipped, businesslike manner. Kate fidgeted nervously with the hem of the sleeve of her dark gray jacket, her eyes avoiding Jack, who sat across the table from her with his attorney, Mark Reed. Jack looked as he always did, neatly dressed in a dark blue suit, his back straight, his eyes calm. There was no anger or pain in his face, only a firm, unbending determination. He wasn't looking at Kate, his eyes were fixed on the judge, an older woman with short gray hair who was leafing through papers as if she'd done it 1,000 times. Sam wasn't present. Jack had insisted that his son not be involved in this process, and Kate, despite everything, was grateful for that. The judge, the Honorable Elizabeth Thorne, looked up from her papers and adjusted her glasses. "We are here to hear the divorce case between Jack Harper and Caitlin Harper," she began, her voice dry but firm. "I understand that the parties attempted to mediate but were unable to reach an agreement. Today, we will discuss custody, property division, and child support. Mr. Reed, you represent the plaintiff. Please begin. Mark Reed stood up, his movements confident but not theatrical. He was a man who knew how to talk to judges without wasting words. Your Honor, my client, Jack Harper, has filed for divorce on the grounds of adultery committed by the defendant, Caitlin Harper. We have evidence of her affair with a third party, Liam Brooks, including correspondence, photographs, and intrigue, and witness testimony. This evidence establishes adultery, which, under Vermont law, affects property division and custody. Mr. Harper also requests full custody of the couple's minor son, Samuel Harper, citing the defendant's emotional instability and her failure to provide a stable environment for the child. We also ask that we approve an asset division that reflects Mr. Harper's contribution to the marital assets, including the marital home, which was transferred to his name prior to the filing of the petition. Kate felt her stomach clench. Reed's words were as precise as shots, every one of them hitting their mark. She knew he was right, she couldn't deny the facts. But hearing it out loud, in such a cold, formal tone, was unbearable. She glanced at Jack, but he was staring straight ahead, his face unreadable. She wanted him to look at her, to see something in his eyes, anger, pain, regret. But he was like a wall, and the wall was impenetrable. Linda Crow stood up, her voice calm but tense. Your Honor, my client, Caitlin Harper, acknowledges that there were difficulties in the marriage, but disputes the characterization of her as emotionally unstable. She was an active participant in raising her son and is entitled to joint custody. With respect to the property, we believe that the transfer of assets to Mr. Harper was made without my client's consent and should be reconsidered. We ask for a fair division of the property and reasonable alimony, given Miss Harper's contributions to the family as a mother and professional. The judge nodded, making notes. Kate felt her heart pounding, but she said nothing. Linda had warned her that this would be a difficult case. The evidence of adultery was overwhelming, and Vermont law did give Jack the upper hand. But she couldn't bear the thought of losing Sam. It was worse than losing her home, her money, or her reputation. Sam was her heart, and the thought of him turning on her was like a knife she'd stabbed herself with. The judge looked at Jack. Mr. Harper, is there anything you would like to add to your attorney's statement? Jack stood up, his movements measured, almost mechanical. He looked at the judge, his voice calm but firm as concrete. Your Honor, I don't want this trial any more than it has to be, he began. But I have to protect my son and provide him with stability. My wife made choices that destroyed our family. I don't demand revenge, but I do demand justice. Sam is my priority. He's already suffered at the hands of his mother, and I can't let that continue. As for the estate, I've worked for years to provide for our family, and the asset transfer was a precaution to protect our future Sam's future. His words were simple, but each one was like a hammer blow. Kate felt her cheeks heat up, but she couldn't argue. He was telling the truth, or at least his version of the truth, which was close enough to the truth to hurt. She glanced at Linda, hoping she would intervene, but the lawyer was just taking notes, her face unreadable. The judge turned to Kate. Miss Harper, is there something you would like to say? Kate swallowed, her throat dry as sand. She stood up, her hands shaking but trying to keep herself under control. Your Honor, she began, her voice quiet but clear. I admit I made a mistake. I'm not proud of what I did. But I never meant to hurt my family. I love my son, and I want to be a part of his life. I don't deny that my actions have affected our marriage, but I'm not emotionally unstable. I just lost control of my life. I'm willing to fight for Sam and our future together. She paused, her eyes filling with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Jack looked at the judge, his face a mask. She knew he wouldn't change his mind, but she still wanted to believe there was a chance to fix it. I understand your position, Mr. Harper, the judge continued. But we have evidence that supports your allegations. This is a serious ground for divorce in Vermont, and it affects issues such as custody and property division. Miss Crow, what do you have to say on your client's behalf? Linda stood up, her voice firm but emotionless. My client acknowledges that her actions caused the breakdown of the marriage, but she disputes the characterization of her as emotionally unstable. She was an active participant in raising her son and is entitled to joint custody. As for the property, we believe that the transfer of assets was made without her consent and should be challenged. We ask for a fair division of the property and reasonable alimony, taking into account her contribution to the family. The judge nodded, her gaze neutral. You have evidence of adultery, Miss Harper, Mark Reed said, standing. Photographs, correspondence, evidence. It is indisputable. My client acted in the best interests of his son to protect him from further emotional distress. He also secured the majority of the family's financial assets, including the family home, and transferred them into his own name to protect his financial future. Kate felt her heart tighten. She knew the evidence against her was overwhelming, but Jack's words cut like a knife. She wanted to protest, to say that she was not as he described her, but the words caught in her throat. She sat up, her hands shaking. The judge looked at her. Miss Harper, is there something you would like to say? Kate stood up, her voice shaking but trying to sound confident. Your Honor, I admit I made a mistake. I'm not proud of it. But I love my son and I want to be a part of his life. I don't deny that my actions affected our marriage, but I'm not emotionally unstable. I just made the wrong choice. Her voice broke and she fell silent. The judge made another note, then looked at the lawyers. I have heard both sides. Given the evidence presented and the laws of the state of Vermont, I am inclined to grant Mr. Harper full custody of Samuel Harper. The division of assets will be determined in accordance with the contributions of the parties, taking into account that Mr. Harper transferred the assets into his own name prior to filing. Child support will be set at a reasonable amount, taking into account the financial situation of both parties. I will make a final decision in 1 week after reviewing all documents. Kate felt the floor slipping from under her feet. She looked at Jack, but he wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the judge. She knew she had lost. And not just the court, but his respect, his trust, his love. After the hearing, Kate walked outside, her coat soaked by the light rain that had started again. She stood under the courthouse awning, her eyes following Jack as he walked toward his car, not looking back. She wanted to call out to him, but her voice died in her throat. She knew he wouldn't stop. I wouldn't look at her, wouldn't forgive. Linda Crow walked up to her, her face serious, but with a hint of sympathy in her eyes. We can appeal, she said quietly, but it will be difficult. The evidence is strong, and the judge is clearly leaning in his direction. Kate nodded, her face pale. I know, she whispered. I just want to see Sam. Linda put her hand on her shoulder. Give him time, Kate. He's confused. He's angry. But he loves you. It will pass. Kate shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. He doesn't want to talk to me, she said, and I can't blame him. Linda didn't answer. She knew the truth hurt, and she didn't want to add to Kate's pain. She simply squeezed her shoulder and walked away to her car. Kate walked back into the house that wasn't her home anymore. She knew she'd have to move out soon. Jack had made that clear through his lawyer. She went into the bedroom and lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Her phone was next to her, but it was silent. No texts from Sam, no calls from Jack, just silence. She thought about the trial, about Jack's words, his calm, unwavering determination. He wasn't mean, he was right. She had destroyed their family, and now she was losing everything. Her home, her son, her reputation, herself. She closed her eyes, feeling the emptiness of home fill her insides. She knew it was her fault, but that knowledge didn't make the pain any easier. She picked up her phone and texted Sam. I love you. Please give me a chance to explain. She waited, but there was no answer. She knew there would be none. She had lost him, like she had lost Jack, like she had lost everything. The Vermont summer was mild, with a warm wind that carried the scent of cut grass and apple blossoms. But to Kate, the air felt heavy, as if it were saturated with her own regrets. She sat in a small rented apartment on the outskirts of Burlington, a room with bare walls and creaky wood floors. The window looked out onto a parking lot where a neighbor's old pickup truck rusted in the sun. Her belongings, a few boxes of books, clothes, and photographs, were neatly stacked in a corner, but she hadn't unpacked them. This place wasn't home. It was just a roof over her head, a temporary refuge from the world she had destroyed. The verdict had come a week ago. Jack had been awarded full custody of Sam, as expected. The house in Vermont they'd built together was now his. Kate had received a small settlement, a portion of the joint savings Jack had agreed to split, and alimony that barely covered her rent and basic expenses. She'd lost everything that had mattered: her family, her stability, her sense of belonging. Her reputation at college was in tatters, and while she hadn't been officially fired, her department chair had made it clear that her contract would not be renewed next semester. Rumors of her affair with Liam had spread like wildfire, and now she was the woman who broke up two families. Kate sat at a small table, a notebook and pen in front of her. She wrote letters to Sam, to Jack, sometimes to herself. It had become her ritual, a way to stay afloat when everything else had sunk. The letters to Sam were full of apologies, explanations, memories of reading books together or laughing at his jokes. The letters to Jack were shorter, more reserved, but they were filled with pain not for herself, but for what she had done to their family. She didn't send them. She knew Jack wouldn't write back, and Sam might not even read them. But she kept writing because it was the only thing she could do. Her phone sat next to her, the screen dark. She didn't expect any more texts from Liam. After their last conversation in the coffee shop, when he'd admitted he'd never intended to leave his wife, she'd blocked his number. She hated him for lying, but she hated herself more for believing him. She'd let him be her escape from a life that felt like a cage. And now she was alone in this small apartment with empty walls and an empty heart. She picked up a pen and started a new letter. Sam, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you'll even want to hear me, but I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you. You were the best thing I ever had, and I lost you because of my stupidity. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. But I love you. I always will. If you ever need to talk, I'm here. Always. Mother. She reread the letter, her fingers shaking. Then she folded it in half and put it in the drawer with the others. She knew she wouldn't send it. Sam didn't answer her texts, didn't pick up when she called. She tried to meet him, drove to Abby's house in Maine, but every time he looked at her like she was a stranger. His eyes, as dark as Jack's, were full of the pain she had caused. She couldn't blame him. She couldn't blame anyone but herself. Jack and Sam moved back to Vermont, but not to their old house. Jack had sold it without telling Kate. He didn't want to live in a place where everything was reminiscent of the past. Instead, he bought a new house more modest but cozy, with a large backyard and a view of the hills. The house was a new beginning, a clean slate for him and Sam. He furnished it simply: wooden furniture, light walls, a few photographs, but none of Kate. He didn't want her shadow hanging over them. Sam adjusted slowly. He spent hours in his room, buried in books or his laptop, but Jack could see the difference. His son was quieter, more thoughtful, his smiles less frequent. Jack tried to be there for him, but he didn't push. He knew Sam needed time to process the pain of Kate's death. He took him to soccer games, helped him with his homework, cooked the dinners Sam loved. But every time he looked at his son, he saw an emptiness in his eyes that he couldn't fill. One evening, as they sat eating dinner, a simple pasta with sauce, Sam suddenly looked up from his plate. "Did she call?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost emotionless. Jack froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. He knew who Sam was talking about, but he didn't want to bring it up first. "Yes," he answered honestly, "several times." "What did she say?" Jack put down his fork and looked at his son. His face was calm, but inside he felt something tightening. He didn't want to lie, but he didn't want to hurt Sam anymore. "She wants to talk to you," he said. "She misses you." Sam nodded, his eyes dropping to his plate. He picked at the pasta, but didn't lift his fork to his mouth. "I don't want to talk to her," he said finally. "Not now." Jack nodded, his hand tightening slightly on the edge of the table. "It's your decision, Sam. I won't force you." Sam looked at him, gratitude flickering in his eyes. He said nothing more, but Jack knew his son valued his honesty. He had always been honest with Sam, even when the truth hurt. It was his principle: no lying, no pretending, no giving false hope. After dinner, Jack cleared away the dishes and Sam went to his room. When he was alone, he took out his phone and checked his messages. Kate had texted again. "Jack, please tell Sam I want to see him. I'll do anything to fix this." He read the message but didn't reply. He didn't know what to say. Kate had destroyed their family and he couldn't forgive her for it. Not for himself, but for Sam. He walked out into the backyard, where the air was cool and smelled of grass. The new house was quieter than the old, with no echoes of the past. But even here, he felt her absence not as a longing, but as a reminder that everything had changed. He wasn't angry at Kate. Anger would have been too easy, too simple. Instead, he felt a determination to protect Sam, to build him a new life without the pain she had brought. Kate sat in her apartment, staring at the stack of unsent letters. She knew they were useless, but she couldn't stop. Writing was the only way she could maintain contact with Sam, however illusory. She tried calling him, texting him, but he didn't answer. She knew Jack wasn't blocking her, he was too honest for that. But he also didn't encourage Sam to talk to her. He'd given his son a choice, and Sam had chosen silence. She drove to Jack's new house, having found out the address through mutual friends. She had no intention of going in, just wanting to see Sam, even if only from a distance. When she parked across the street, she spotted him in the window, sitting at the table, his face focused on his laptop. Jack was in the kitchen, chopping something for dinner. They looked like a team, like two people who had found a way to move on without her. Kate sat in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She wanted to get out, to knock on the door, but she knew it was useless. Sam didn't want to see her. Jack didn't want to hear her. She was a stranger in their world, and it was her own fault. She walked back to her flat and opened her laptop to check her email. There was a letter from the college, a formal notice that her contract would not be renewed. The reason was phrased softly as budget cuts, but Kate knew the truth. Her reputation was in tatters, and no one wanted to keep her. Liam hadn't helped. Of course, rumors of his affair with her had spread, and his wife, Anna, had made sure that Kate became an academic pariah. She couldn't blame her. She deserved it. Kate closed her laptop and lay down on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her life was in shambles, and she didn't know how to put it back together. She'd lost Sam, Jack, her home, her job, herself. The letters she'd written were her last attempt to hold on to the past, but she knew it was useless. It was too late. The rift was too deep, and she'd created it. She picked up her phone and wrote Sam another message. "I will always love you. Forgive me." She hit send, but didn't wait for a response. She knew there wouldn't be one. Jack sat on the porch of their new house, looking at the stars. Sam was in his room, doing his homework. The new house was their sanctuary, a place where they could start over. Jack felt no triumph from winning the case. He felt no joy from defending Sam. He felt only weariness, the deep, bone-deep weariness that came from having to be in control. He knew Kate was texting Sam. He saw the messages on his son's phone, but he didn't read them. It wasn't his business. He'd given Sam the freedom to choose, and Sam had chosen silence. Jack respected that. He respected his son, his strength, his pain. He knew Sam would get through this in time, and he would be there to help. He took out his phone and looked at the latest message from Kate. He didn't answer, but he read it. "Tell Sam I love him." He put the phone in his pocket and looked at the stars. He didn't know how he felt. He didn't know if he could ever forgive. But he knew one thing. He would do anything to make Sam okay. It was a matter of principle. Kate lay in her apartment in the dark, her eyes open, but she couldn't see the ceiling. She saw Sam, his face, his eyes full of pain. She saw Jack, his calm that was stronger than any anger. She saw her life crumbling like sand, and she didn't know how to put it back together. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she did not write a letter. She simply lay there, listening to the silence that was louder than any sound. Winter came early in Vermont, blanketing the hills in a thin layer of snow that crunched like glass underfoot. Jack and Sam's new house stood on a quiet street surrounded by old pine trees, their branches bending under the weight of the snow. It was more modest than their old home, but it was warm not just from the fireplace Jack lit each evening, but from the new, fragile harmony he and his son were building day after day. It wasn't a perfect union, but it was real, forged out of pain and honesty and time. Jack stood by the kitchen window, watching Sam clear the snow from the path. The teenager, bundled up in a dark green jacket, worked with concentration, his movements sharp but precise, like his father's. Jack noticed how Sam had grown in the last few months, not just physically, but mentally. His eyes, still dark and serious, now occasionally caught the light when he laughed or talked about something that interested him. He was still quiet, withdrawn, but there was a new strength in him, as if he were learning to hold the world on his shoulders. Jack turned to the stove where the coffee was brewing. He no longer drank it black and sugarless. He now added a spoonful of honey, the way his sister Abby liked it. It was a small thing, but it reminded him that life moved forward, even when it seemed like everything was standing still. He poured 2 mugs, one for himself and one for Sam, and walked out onto the porch. "Break," he shouted, raising his mug. Sam turned, his cheeks pink with the cold. He stuck his shovel into a snowdrift and walked over, shaking snow from his boots, his breath puffing out in the frosty air. "You could help, you know," he said, accepting the mug. His voice was light, with a hint of humor that hadn't been there a couple of months ago. Jack chuckled as he sipped his coffee. "I'm paying you for this," he replied. "Consider it your training." Sam rolled his eyes, but a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. They stood on the porch, looking out at the snow-covered yard. The silence between them was comfortable, like a warm sweater on a cold day. Jack knew Sam was still thinking about Kate. He could see it in the way he looked at her when he was hovering over his phone or looking at the old photograph Jack had left on the mantel. But Sam didn't talk about her, and Jack didn't ask. He gave his son space, knowing that some wounds only healed in silence. "How are you doing at school?" Jack asked, sipping his coffee. Sam shrugged, but his face was less tense than before. "Fine. The biology project got an A. Mr. Clark said I could try to apply for a research fellowship next year." Jack nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly with pride. "This is serious. I'm proud of you." Sam looked at him, and for a second his face softened. "Thanks, Dad." They finished their coffee, and Sam went back to shoveling. Jack watched him work and thought about how far they had come in these months. The divorce was final, the papers signed, the house sold, the new one their sanctuary. Jack didn't feel relieved. Relief would have been too easy. He felt responsible. For Sam, for their new life, for not letting the past ruin the future. He went back into the house and sat at his desk, opening his laptop. His firm had won a new contract, renovating an old theater in downtown Burlington. It was a challenging project, but Jack loved challenges. They made him feel alive and gave him a purpose. He worked until late in the evening, until Sam called him to dinner pizza, which they ordered because, as Sam said, "We deserve a break from your cooking." Jack laughed, and the laugh was genuine, a rare moment of levity. But even in those moments, he didn't forget about Kate. Not because he missed her, but because she was part of their story. He didn't hate her. He felt nothing for her except tiredness and a firm determination to move on. She had made a choice, and he had made his. It was a matter of principle not to take revenge, not to feel sorry, but simply to live. Kate sat in her small rented apartment, the window open and the cold air rushing in, bringing with it the smell of snow. She held a mug of tea, which had long since gone cold. There was a notepad on the table in front of her, but she wasn't writing. The letters she had once sent to Sam and Jack were a thing of the past. She no longer saw the point in them. They were her way of clinging to something that was already lost, and she had finally realized that. It had been 4 months since the judge had made his decision. 4 months since she had moved into this apartment, leaving behind her home, her family, her life. She had found work in a bookstore, not the career she had dreamed of, but better than nothing. Her days were simple. Work, her home, the books she read at night, trying to drown out the silence. She had changed. Not outwardly, though her hair was shorter, her face a little paler, but inside. She had become calmer, more mature, as if the storm that had destroyed her life had left behind a clear but cold sky. She didn't call Sam anymore. After dozens of unanswered messages, she knew he wasn't ready. Maybe he never would be. She didn't blame him. She blamed herself. Every night she fell asleep thinking about his eyes dark as Jack's, full of the pain she'd caused. She knew she'd lost him, and that knowledge was like a knife she carried in her chest. She didn't write to Jack either. She saw him once, by chance, in the city center. He was walking with Sam. They were talking about something, and Sam was smiling not like before, but still smiling. Kate hid around the corner, her heart pounding, but she didn't go up to him. She knew she had no right. Jack looked as always collected, confident, unyielding. But there was a new lightness in his posture, as if he had thrown off the weight she had hung on him. Kate finished her tea and stood up to close the window. She looked outside, where the snow was falling in soft flakes, covering everything. Her life was not what she had imagined. She had dreamed of passion, of freedom, of being someone more. And now she was alone in a small apartment, with a job that barely made ends meet. But there was something liberating in this simplicity. She was no longer running from herself. She accepted her pain, her mistakes, her emptiness. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old letter, the first one she had ever written to Sam. She read it over, her fingers stroking the paper. "I will always love you." She folded the letter and put it back. Maybe someday he will read it. Maybe someday he will understand. But she didn't expect that. She had learned to live without hope. Jack and Sam were sitting in the living room in front of the fireplace. There was a pizza box on the table, and an old Indiana Jones movie was playing on the TV. Sam was laughing at some scene, and Jack looked at him, feeling something in his chest lighten. They didn't talk about Kate, but her shadow was still there, in their silence, in their cautious steps toward each other. "Dad," Sam said suddenly, without looking up from the screen, "do you think she's okay?" Jack froze, his hand hovering over the slice of pizza. He knew who Sam was talking about. He always did. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I hope so." Sam nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen, but Jack could see he was thinking about her. He didn't know how to help his son, but he knew he had to be there. It was all he could do. "If you want to talk to her, that's fine with me," Jack added, his voice calm but firm. "It's your choice." Sam looked at him, gratitude flashing in his eyes. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. Jack nodded and turned back to the movie. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if Sam would ever forgive Kate. He didn't know if he could. But he knew one thing. He and Sam were together, and that was enough. They were building a new life, one step at a time, and that life was theirs. Kate stepped outside, her boots crunching in the snow. She walked toward the bookstore where the morning shift was waiting. The sky was clear, the stars still shining, even though morning was breaking. She paused, looking at them, and thought about how everything had changed. She had lost everything, but there was something honest about that loss. She was no longer pretending, no longer running, no longer seeking refuge in the words of others. She knew there would be no second chances, not in this life, and maybe that was the right thing to do. She had made a choice, and now she was living with the consequences. She took a breath of cold air and moved on, her steps firm despite the pain in her chest. Life went on. No final scenes, no dramatic reconciliations, just went on. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.